Okay, so when we're talking about Precambrian time, what we're talking about is roughly the first 4 billion years the Earth has been in existence. So if we go back 4.56 billion years ago, we'll see that Earth formed. And then we had crustal formation here occurring here. We're starting to see the early atmosphere forming. We're starting to see oceans forming and things of that nature. And then we see life happening about 3.5 billion years ago. And the life that evolved was this cyanobacteria. Okay, so we had some stuff going on before that, but we start seeing cyanobacteria. And cyanobacteria is interesting because that one started to do photosynthesis. So we started seeing photosynthesis happening, and about 2 billion years ago, we saw a change in the Earth's atmosphere where we started to see oxygen building up. Once we had that going on, then we started seeing these oxygen organisms, these oxygen tolerant organisms living, and we saw the rise of the eukaryotic cell. The eukaryote started to show up. And then we start seeing it about maybe 3/4 of a billion years ago, we see fossils of multicelled organisms. So we can see that we had a long period of time where we had single-celled organisms before we got to multicellular, but we saw some of the changes that had to happen. So the oxygen in our atmosphere is actually a product of life on our planet. So if we go back in time, if we take a look at it, we have our formation of the earth, and we can see geologically that we had a lot of cooling, volcanic activity. We're starting to see these volcanic gases build up in the atmosphere. We're starting to see water vapor condense and cool off and help cooling of the crust and form the earth. But then we start to see some of these other living things. And life started in water because water would protect those living things from the cosmic radiation of the sun. As we started to have some of these photosynthetic organisms and we built oxygen up, that oxygen got converted into ozone, and that provides us with a layer that protects us from the ultraviolet rays of the sun, and we were able to explore land afterwards as living things. So I just wanted you to see that this is what we're talking about in Precambrian. We're talking about the Earth starting to settle down and form crustal plates, oceanic plates. The oceans are forming, the atmosphere is forming. Okay, so that's it for our video. As always, the lessons will go into a lot more detail. I just wanted to give you a brief introduction. Good luck on your quiz, and we'll see you in the next video. Okay, so the Paleozoic Era is made up of several different periods, and these are what we're going to talk about a little bit. They range from the Cambrian all the way to the Permian period, and we can see that it went from about 542 million years ago to about 300 million years ago. Okay, so what happened during the Paleozoic Era? Well, back in the Cambrian period, about 500,000 years ago or so, what we notice is we have this invertebrate explosion. So it's called the Cambrian explosion, and that's where we had a more stable Earth environment, and that allowed life to start to explore, fill, and adapt to all these different niches. In the Ordovician period, we saw jawless fishes evolve, and we started to see the first vertebrates coming as well. In the Silurian period, it's noted that we had plants that started to spread on land, and then we also had amphibians come during the Devonian. And during this period of time, we also had many different fishes evolve, including the cartilaginous fishes, our sharks, and things of that nature. So in the Carboniferous period, it's named that because that's where we had these large swampy forests that as they died and they layered out over time, that's where we formed most of our coal deposits. And then the Paleozoic era ended with the Permian mass extinction about 248 million years ago. This is also the time that Pangea started to form, and it's also where reptiles started to become one of the more dominant types of animals. So how does environmental change affect what's living on the planet? Well, when we have a change in environment, it forces the animals to adapt to these new conditions. And when it does so, it puts different pressures on the animals, and that's one of the evolutionary pressures. Sometimes, however, these environmental changes can be drastic and sudden, like really large changes. When that happens, we end up with what we call a mass extinction, and that's where you have lots of different types of organisms dying off all at once. And our Earth's history is marked with a whole bunch of these mass extinctions, and we'll talk about one at the end of the Permian period. So the Cambrian period is, we keep going back to this, this is where we had an explosion of life. So this is where we had a stable environment, and we can see all these different living types that were evolved out at that period of time. We have our slugs, we have our insects, we have our shell mollusks, we have jellyfish. Most of the invertebrate types evolved during this period of time, and it was because we had invertebrates, but we also had new niches that were stable enough to allow life to evolve to fill them. Now, one of the things that allowed this Cambrian explosion to occur is we had a supercontinent, and that supercontinent broke up during the Cambrian, and as such, it created shallow seas in between the breaking pieces. So if we imagine we had one landmass, as that one landmass separated into two landmasses, we had this narrow, shallow seas that were here, and those were warm water bodies, and that's where we saw a lot of this life explosion occurring. These new environments, like we said, they promoted new life and a massive explosion in life in only 15 million years. So we saw a whole bunch of evolution in a real short period of time, and that's why we call this the explosion of life. Now, the Ordovician period, we notice that we have this separation a little bit more. We can see we have one of these supercontinents, Gondwana, here that was separated out, and we can see that we have all of these other pieces kind of moving away, and what it did is it created this ocean here, and this ocean was a warmer ocean, and that allowed this diversity to increase. We started to see jawless fishes evolve, we started to see some land plants evolving, and at the very end of this period, it's marked with one of our first mass extinctions, and we believe that that was either caused by a large ice age or by a volcanic explosion that would have put the dust out and would have just basically contaminated the atmosphere, and that would have caused a lot of issues. So in this graphic, I just wanted to show you what we're talking about with the Ordovician. We call it a new beginning. At the end of the Cambrian, there was a mass extinction, and most of these periods, that's how they were marked at the end. And what that did is that created new environments, and the animals that were able to survive were then able to adapt and evolve and fill these open niches. Now, during the Silurian period, we had a lot of reef building going on. We saw fish evolution continue. We also saw the formation of these guys here, the Euryptids, and these were the beginning of arthropods. We had some before, but we can kind of see some other ones forming here. On land, we had the mosses start to develop, and those are our first vascular plants. And we also saw animals start coming out onto the land. So the Silurian, we kind of had not so much diversity, but we saw a lot of exploitation. We saw some evolution occurring, but it was basically let's get onto land and start spreading out and start exploring that whole new environment of land. Now the Devonian period came, and at the Devonian period what we saw new was this whole idea of a jawed fish. So now we had a fish that instead of it having a permanently open mouth, now they had jaws that could open and close. And speaking of jaws, this is also when we saw the evolution of sharks. So sharks have been around since the Devonian period. Mind you, they've evolved over time, but this is where we start to see the first sharks appear. We had reefs built out of sponges and corals. We started to see the first forests on land, and most of them were going to be tree ferns as opposed to trees like we see now. So just really large, massive ferns that form these forests. We also saw a rise in insects. We saw the first amphibians. And at the end of the Devonian, we had another mass extinction, and that mass extinction took out things like our armored fish. So, like we mentioned, most of these periods were going to be started off with the end of a mass extinction, exploitation of a new environment, and it grows. We have diversity happening, and then we have a mass extinction at the end that marks the end of the period. Now, the Carboniferous period is actually made up of two different periods, the Mississippian and the Pennsylvanian. But the highlight for these periods is that we had these coal swamp forests. Okay, during this time we had more of these plates spreading, we had some landmass collisions, but it was really these forests that give us our name. Okay, and what happened was as these forests, and you can see in the picture as the animals and the organisms and the plants died, they would fall down into these swampy forests, and over time, heat and pressure changed these into these vast coal beds that we now mine for coal to use for power. Other things that we saw were seed-bearing plants came to rise. We started to see some winged insects, and look here, we're starting to have now our first reptiles. So the Carboniferous period is where we laid down some of the world's greatest coal beds. Okay, so the end of the Paleozoic is the Permian period, and the Permian period showed us the formation of Pangea. We can see that here, and that's where all of these different land masses came back together to form that supercontinent. Our climate was warming. On land, we had the conifers or the cone plants, and they became abundant. We started to see some mammal-like reptiles. So some of them had large sails and were able to regulate their body temperature. So we started to see some warm-bloodedness. And then at the very end of the Permian, we had the Permian extinction. And this one killed 96% of all species. So that's a mass extinction when 96% of the living things on the planet died at the end of the Permian extinction. Okay, that's it for our video. As always, good luck in the lessons and the quizzes, and we'll see you in the next video. So if we look at the Mesozoic Era, what we're looking at is a period of time from about 250 million years ago to about 65 million years ago. In this time, we have three different periods. We have the Triassic, the Jurassic, and the Cretaceous Period. And some of the highlights you can see on here, we're noticing that seed plants, including the conifers or your pine trees, are becoming more common. We're seeing early mammals are evolving. We're seeing modern types of fishes are evolving. We're noticing that Pangea splits apart at the end of the Triassic, beginning of the Jurassic period. So now we're seeing a more modern looking landscape where we're seeing the continents like they are today. Not exactly, but getting into that type of area. We noticed that we had many dinosaurs evolve and then they continued to flourish up until the end of the Mesozoic Era. A big one is flowering plants. The angiosperms evolved here. And then finally, we'll talk about this mass extinction event that happened 65 million years ago with a meteorite impact. Okay, so what we're talking about when we're talking about the beginning of the Mesozoic Era, this Triassic period, you notice that we have a term here, panthalos, and that means all sea. What that meant is if you looked at Earth from space during the Triassic period, we would have had the one supercontinent of Pangea, and then the rest of the planet was this one big ocean. And we noticed that even though it was in a temperate type climate, it was kind of tropical here and there, this supercontinent, it was mild. At the end of the Triassic is when we had the breakup of that supercontinent. And that's what kind of allowed for a lot of the evolution to flourish in the Jurassic period. In the Triassic period, we had some, remember we just had a mass extinction, so we're having all of these different animals that are now exploring and exploiting these new niches. And that's when we start to see the first dinosaurs. We also saw the first mammals, which were going to be small rodent-like looking creatures. And then we also started to see these gymnosperms, these seeded plants. And those would be like your pine trees and things of that nature. Okay, so now let's talk about the Jurassic period. Geologically, the Jurassic period was pretty phenomenal in the fact that Pangea started to split. And when it did so, we had all of these like shallow, warm seas that were like protected in between the continents as they were starting to separate and migrate apart. And what this did is this gave us a new type of environment to exploit. Instead of having that one big sea, that Panthalassa that we saw, now we're starting to see different seas, different oceans starting to form. And that allowed for new things to evolve, and we have our more modernized fishes. So now what we're seeing is the fish evolution coming through. And not that we had modern species, but we have modern types of fish. We also saw some reptiles return to the water. So our plesiosaurs and our ichthyosaurs, these are reptiles that's ancestors evolved on land, and they went back into the water. They had lungs, but they adapted back to aquatic life. So these big aquatic dinosaurs now returning to the water. Speaking of dinosaurs, we had all kinds of dinosaurs happening here. We had the meat eaters like the Allosaurus that was running around in the Jurassic period. We had our plant eaters like our brachiosaurs. We also had some flying ones, some pterosaurs. And the pterosaurs, through skin flaps, were able to glide and possibly fly. It's tough by fossil evidence. It's kind of, people are on the fences whether they could fly on their own or not. But then we also saw this guy here, this Archaeopteryx. And Archaeopteryx was the future of birds. So birds evolved from the dinosaurs, and Archaeopteryx was one of those cross species. It was one of those that had the reptilian traits and the bird-like traits. Some of the dinosaurs in the Jurassic had feathers, and feathers now are the trait of birds. So we can see where this evolution is going. And here we just have a sample of what it probably looked like during the Jurassic time. Notice we have our large dinosaurs, we have our plant eaters, we have our big meat eaters hanging out, we have our pterosaurs here. Notice the conifers, so we have our seed plants that are now thriving, And then this guy right down here in the corner would be like what Archaeopteryx would have looked like. So kind of a cross between a bird and a reptile. Now we get to the Cretaceous period. So Pangaea continued to split, and we had these inland seas going on. Geologically, some of the other neat things, Madagascar split from Africa. And if you look at Madagascar evolution-wise, biologic-wise, it's different from Africa in a lot of ways. So this split was kind of interesting and neat. We're going to see that swamps from the Cretaceous form some of our coal beds, especially those found in Canada and the western United States. We had our dinosaurs still here. And one of the things that's kind of ironic is our big villain from Jurassic Park was actually a Cretaceous dinosaur, our T-Rex. We saw the evolution of snakes. So we're starting to see snakes in the fossil record here. We have some more modern mammal groups that are evolving at this point in time. Not that we had the modern mammals. Remember, these are just groups. So these are just types of mammals that will evolve into our modern day species. And the big one is we had the advent of flowering plants. So if we look over here, we can see some modern day looking insects, the modern day plants going on. You can see some mammals down here. We have our suite of dinosaurs up here is going on as well. And the Cretaceous period ended with this huge mass extinction. So 65 million years ago is when we had this one, and that also marked the end of the Mesozoic Era. Okay, so now let's talk about the end of the Mesozoic Era and this mass extinction that happened 65 million years ago. Now, we know that there was a mass extinction because that was the end of the dinosaurs. So we lost an entire suite of animals this way. There's other animals went extinct. I don't want you to think that it was just individually going out after the dinosaurs. But remember, with these mass extinctions, we're seeing a rapid change in the climate, rapid change in the environment, and it kills off most of the species. And the benefit of this is now it opens up niches for the animals that survive, and we see this massive influx of new animals or new types of animals coming through. Now, what caused the Mesozoic mass extinction? That's kind of up for debate with some. It used to be a little bit more, but we've gotten a lot better with our increased data through satellites and things. And what we believe is that we had this one large meteor that came down and struck the Earth. And the picture here is probably a really good representation of what it would have looked like. It would have crashed into the Gulf of Mexico near the Yucatan Peninsula and hit with such force that as it came through, it would have pushed the water away, so it would have hit land when it impacted. And this impact would have jolted the Earth, thrown up a lot of dust, which would have probably stuck in the atmosphere for a while. And the problem with this is if you take our atmosphere and you put that dust in there, then suddenly the plants aren't able to photosynthesize. The plants start to die. When the plants die, the plant eaters start to die, and then the meat eaters start to die because of lack of food. So you can see how this is just a chain of events that goes through. We believe it was this meteorite that attacked because if we look around the Earth at 65 million years ago, in our rock layer, so we have our rocks here, and we'd have a layer there, and then we'd have another layer here. If we look at the 65 million year ago age, we find this thin layer that has iridium in it, and that generally comes from meteorites. It comes from space. So there's a layer of that all around the world. Everywhere where we find 65 million years old, that's what we're finding, that layer. And that led us to believe that it was an asteroid strike. So the big issue was for years is, okay, well, if this big asteroid hit, where did it hit? And with satellite technology, what we've been able to do is we can actually have found the impact crater. And it's down in the Gulf of Mexico near the Yucatan Peninsula. Okay, so that's it for my video. As always, you'll learn more in the lesson, and good luck on the quiz, and we'll see you in the next video. So our quick overview of the Cenozoic Era. If we take a look here, it happened from about 65 million years ago till today. We're in the Cenozoic Era right now. We had a bunch of different things happen. We remember at 65 million years ago, we had the extinction of the dinosaurs, and what we saw was this massive evolution of mammals. And that's why we call this Cenozoic Era the Age of Mammals. The Alps started to form in Europe. We saw that India collided with Asia and the Himalayan mountains started to form. Climates began to cool a little bit, and that was key to our mammal evolution, and we'll talk about that in the next slide. About 40 million years ago or so, we saw that grasses evolved and started to spread, and this allowed our grass-eating mammals to evolve and then flourish. And then in the Quaternary Period, what we notice is we have ice ages going on. We have these large ice age mammals, the giant sloths, the woolly mammoths, the mastodons, things like that thrived, they evolved, and then they went extinct. And we see modern humans come to the scene. So, why were the mammals so successful? Well, for them to be successful, they had to be able to outcompete the reptiles. And one of the key features that allowed them to do this was the fact that they were warm blooded. So, they now had this hair, this fur covering, which insulated them and allowed them to regulate their body temperature. Remember, dinosaurs don't have this. They may have been cool blooded, but they weren't warm blooded. So, if you have a pet snake or a pet lizard or a pet turtle, you know that it has to sun itself to warm its body up. Mammals actually were able to keep the heat from respiration inside, and they were able to regulate their body temperatures that way. With the extinction of the dinosaurs, it opened up a whole bunch of niches, and the mammals were able to outcompete and fulfill those niches. So that's why we see this explosion of the mammals. Okay, so let's take a look at the Tertiary Period. Notice that Pangaea was continuing to split. 50 million years ago, you could look at the map and it kind of looks like it does today. I mean, you're seeing the differences here. Remember that India is going to collide with Asia here, and we're going to have some joining up of the continents and spreading out a little bit more. So it's still moving around a bit. One of the things we noticed is that we had these cooler climates, and we kind of hinted about that when we talked about mammals. We saw the evolution of songbirds. So that one's something new. So we had birds coming along. Now we have songbirds. We have these mammal evolutions like we talked about. And they were kind of key and tied to some of the ways that they ate. That was kind of a big one. We had our meat eaters, and they developed those meat eating type, slicing teeth, grabbing teeth, things of that nature. We have our plant eaters, which had the flat type of grazing eaters, and then with the advent of grass, that just made them explode a little bit more. And then we had rodents, and one of the neat things about rodents is they have self-sharpening teeth. So as they bite down on things like that, they actually continue to sharpen their teeth, and then they can use those sharp teeth to like burrow into things. So if we went back to the Tertiary Period, what we would see is something that looked a little bit like it does today in the grasslands. You would start to see some of the mammoths, the mastodons. You would see birds in the air, large mammal predators. So it kind of starting to look like what we would see now. And this brings us to the Quaternary Period, and this is our modern time here. Geologically, what we're noticing is the advance and retreat of glaciers. So we can kind of see where we have glacial times down here and then interglacial times. And you can see this glacier, how it extends and moves. And this coming and going of the glaciers would have drastically changed the climate in areas. And that's why we were allowed to have these larger, like the mastodons and mammoths, that we would have these large animals that could survive with these changes. They were able to maintain the body heat when it got cold, and they would migrate with the glaciers. Now, we noticed that we had the extinction of them about 10,000 years ago. That's about the time of the last ice age when it ended. So at the last ice age, when they no longer had that ability, the climate started to warm up a little bit. Food might have changed a little bit for them, but we do notice the extinction of the large animals. And not just the mastodons and mammoths, but your giant sloths and things of that nature also. A couple other things when we're talking about ice ages, in the lessons they'll tell you a little bit about the Milankovitch cycles. And that was 3 different cycles that interrelated, and when they all hit the same time, it would cause an ice age. And they'll go through that in the lesson a little bit more. We'll just mention the name here. And one of the big things we notice in the Quaternary is the migration of Homo sapiens. So modern man came onto the picture during the Quaternary Period. And that may have helped out with the extinctions of some of these larger animals. Okay, so that's it for our videos for this course. Good luck on your quiz and your final exam, and we'll see you in the videos in the next course.